This is a lecture about early modern photography from Santa Rosa JC, and this is for my Art 2.3 classes. And so first there's a list of 5 major developments, and not to be intending a pun, but major developments in the history of early photography. And first is the development of the very first photos that could be reproduced from a negative by a French inventor. We'll discuss his first photo in our next slide. Daguerre from Paris. And so in 1837, that's the beginning, really, the birth of modern photography, the first patented process for reproducing photos from a negative was developed in France. The next major development was in 1888 when the Kodak Photography Company, which, as some of you know, is no longer in business. They couldn't make the transition to digital photography fast enough, but they were the leading photography company in the world. They produced a handheld camera that was a much smaller, lighter weight than earlier cumbersome cameras, and was affordable for average middle-class families in America. It was called the Brownie. That was in 1888. And that actually expanded, of course, the accessibility of photography to millions of people that couldn't have taken photos before. So families began taking photos of themselves, each other, of course, and friends, and trips and visits to historic and interesting natural sites. So there was an explosion of images after that taken by average people. And then in 1893, Thomas Edison invented the motion picture camera. There is some debate as to whether or not it was used at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, not the camera, I should say, but films from the first films he had taken, moving pictures. But we know that year he did invent the camera, and he used it at his laboratory. He created a giant film, which was not a studio, it was a giant black box, actually. I think it was made out of metal, called Black Maria. They nicknamed it, the workers there. And they filmed several early 1 and 2 minute, that's all they could do at one time. Motion pictures, of course, with no sound, of a boxer. Another one was of a man sneezing. And then I believe the debate is over whether at some point there might have been photos taken of Little Egypt at that World's Fair in Chicago. Or not photos, I meant film actually captured of her. But there was some kind of a dance that was captured on the camera equipment, the early, again, Edison invention in 1893 of the first motion picture camera. That was seen that year and may or may not have been shown at the 1893 Chicago Fair. And then in 1906, and we'll be covering this toward the end of the slide presentation, the Lumiere Brothers, again from France, discovered a process with multiple different layers of color filters for producing or reproducing color photos, which had not been possible before. All earlier color images had been hand-tinted in books and magazines and things. So that was a major breakthrough, of course. And then finally, in 1933, again, Kodak in the United States developed the first commercially available color film for cameras that were already, most American families had. In fact, my grandfather, and obviously therefore my father and his brothers and both parents all went to the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. It was amazingly popular in the middle of the Great Depression. It drew tens of millions of people brought with them a camera, to take photos, color photos, and bought. It was like $1 a roll, which was not cheap back then, but middle-class people could afford that. Photos at that fair. I've never got to see them, but I would imagine they would have been, very unusually, quick views of people standing in front of all the pavilions and recording an historic event. So that then again it led to an increase in, almost an explosion in the number of average Americans, at least at first, and then eventually around the world, at least the developed world, who could afford color film and now take color photos of themselves and friends and places they travel to. Okay. This is the first photograph produced from a negative, and it was patented by Daguerre, and so of course that makes this an absolutely earth-shaking, world-shaking image. It was taken in 1837 in the studio of Daguerre. And so the artist, because photographers are artists, as well as, in this case, an inventor. His last name is Daguerre, and it's just called the Artist Studio, making that point. He saw himself as an artist. 1837. Okay, so what you see are just common objects that many still life photos were going to be taken after this. People's own homes or work spaces, studios around the world, of objects they could find around their home or their workspace, arranged in supposedly an artistic pattern of some kind. But he was really just showing the world that he had invented a new technique, which boiled down to his taking metal plates and covering or coating one surface of them with light-sensitive chemicals, and then those plates would, if placed in a light box, which would be a rather large, heavy box that in essence is an early camera, could capture an image in a negative form, in reverse form of where the light was there would be dark and vice versa on that plate. And that became the first actual negative, and photos taken from that, of course, became the first reproducible photographs in the world. It's a major world event. And the thing being, though, that this was a very time-consuming and expensive process, the chemicals and the metal plates and things. Not most people, the average person, even middle class or upper middle class, couldn't afford that or didn't have the wherewithal or the access to the materials. So only a few well-to-do experimenters followed after the invention here in the U.S. and Europe, Daguerre's invention, and took their own photos. We'll see one of those in the next slide, an Englishman who was inspired to do his own photos with a similar process. But this is the first real photograph in the world, in essence, at least first photo that was reproduced. And so you see a wine gourd right there in the middle. This is France, of course, that makes sense. These objects are arranged on the windowsill of his home in Paris. There's a plaster bas-relief cast of a nude female figure, probably a goddess. 2 plaster cherubs, right, babies, angels' heads, and then another plaster cast of a ram, right, looking down on the wall, and then a framed print, and then it looks to be some flowers, perhaps in the far corner, and perhaps part of a butchered animal hanging above those on the far right of the photo. Of course, it looks, primitive to us today, but this was really a mind-boggling achievement, and Daguerre became world famous almost instantly because he was able to patent this and was able and actually willing to share his invention with a lot of other people, those who had the wherewithal. Other amateur photographers at that time, of course, everyone would have been an amateur photographer who came to his studio. He was wanting to show them the process and let them experiment with it. So it spread the knowledge, slowly at first, of how to take such photos. Okay, this is black and white of course, all photos were, like I said, until about 1906. So there's no warm or cool shades. It's all neutral. Very strong modeling because it's a realistic image of a real set of objects in real daylight on the faces and, of course, everywhere on the wall, on the edges of the windowsill. All the simulated textures, and they are simulated here, of course, are realistic and sharp on the plaster casts and the gourd and so forth. It's both stable and dynamic, stable on the framed print on the wall and the windowsill, but dynamic on just about everything else. Most of the other objects are at diagonals. And of course there is visual line, not carved or painted, but visual line around the edges of all the figures of the nude female, the two baby angel heads, and the gourd, I should say, and the frame around the print. So those are all visual lines, even though they're reflecting carved lines in the case of the plaster casts. They actually are just visual lines here, of course, because they're not carved onto the negative. And then we have the largest mass is the windowsill. That's easy. And then the plaster cast lying against the windowsill. And then it's a close call, perhaps the gourd, and then the two baby angels or cherubs' heads. For space, here it's a realistic image, so it's got overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size, and scientific perspective within this image, though it wasn't hand-drawn, so those are not techniques. That's just how this image appears. Of course, this is an indoor scene, so there's no atmospheric perspective. The rhythm is obvious with repeated shapes of the angels' heads and the patterns of the gourd, right, itself, and then the details on the plaster cast of the nude female figure. And objects that look like coins, perhaps, on the windowsill itself. So there's a lot of rhythm. It's powerful rhythm. And it's roughly balanced, left to right, and I would say top to bottom as well. Depends on how you want to consider it. But of course, there is some empty space in the upper left corner, so you could say that makes it weighted more left to right. It would be unbalanced somewhat, perhaps, towards the right. But roughly balanced, I think, top to bottom. And again, some people might think, no, there's a few more little details of objects below the middle. So you could make the case that it is slightly unbalanced toward the bottom. Okay. This next slide is Talbot, his name, the photographer's name, Talbot, The Open Door, 1843. Talbot was an amateur experimenter and, of course, early photographer, which his early experimental phases, before Daguerre invented his and patented his process, he discovered a process for using paper to make prints. First, the paper was used, soaked in chemicals, used to make a negative, and then if you place that on top of another piece of paper and expose that to light, it could reproduce the image in a positive manner. So that's the basis for the first 100 and some years of photographic printing. So he's credited with discovering that process. But when Daguerre came out, he heard about Daguerre's invention. He realized that there was his photos were a little bit softer and less focused than Daguerre's early images, that he needed to modify his process. And so he did, and was able to produce sharper photos. And then he came out with a book called The Pencil of Nature, which was all paper prints from paper negatives of different images of mostly rural scenes. He lived in rural England. And this is one of those, probably from that book. In any case, it's typical of his early work, which is an idyllic, almost nostalgic look at, centuries-old farmhouse. Probably is very old. Obviously, look at the worn, medieval, probably stonework on the walls, and the heavy oak door with nail studs, the kind of thing you would have seen in houses from the 14th or 15th, 16th century, perhaps, all over England. And so he lived in that kind of an environment. I believe he owned this house or this building on an estate. He was wealthy. So he had time to experiment with these things, and he could afford the materials. So here he also had one other claim to fame, in that he's one of the first photographers to see photography as an art form and try to create artistic compositions with his photos. For instance, here, the way the door is open partially and the shadows across it, plus the broom leaning against the wall, and the shadow of it down at the bottom of the door, those all diagonal lines, those all contrast visually with the vertical lines of the building itself, the door and the walls, creating an interesting juxtaposition. So he became one of the most well-known and successful early amateur photographers, not just in Great Britain, but his work was popular in Europe and North America. And he probably produced, or one, if not the one of the first books of photos for mass audience to be able to buy. Now, this is balanced. No question this is balanced. But some people, because the walls, the portion of the wall, I mean, that's visible, the stone wall, to the far right is wider. But the door, look carefully and you'll see where the frame of the door cuts across almost the direct center of the photo. So it's roughly balanced left to right. And I would argue top to bottom as well. And then we see the sharp simulated textures on the rough wooden door, the bristles of the broom, and the rusticated stone walls, and the round, smooth metal hanging lamp on the wall on the right. It's full of the rhythm. We already mentioned the diagonal lines, but also the materials of the nails in the door and the blocks of stone on the wall, the vines growing on the wall. For space, here we have, again, it's a real image of real space. So you have overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size, and again, in the visual sense, not as a hands-drawn technique, obviously. Scientific perspective, too. There'd be a vanishing point beyond the back wall, but of course there's no atmospheric perspective here because it's not a color image. And of course, this being black and white, all of the colors are neutral. There's no warm or cool colors. The largest mass would probably be the stone wall, or the portion of it on the right, and then it's a close call, perhaps the door, and then the portion of the stone wall on the left, and then the broom. And it is, I think we've said, dynamic right on the diagonal lines and stable on the walls, dynamic again on the broom and the vines growing on the walls. And here there's visual line around the edges of all the optics, nothing drawn or carved. Okay. This is one of the most remarkable images in the history of photography, and absolutely one of my favorites. There are so many levels on which it is way ahead of its time. Let's start with the fact that whenever I've shown this photo without telling to classes or groups of people at lectures of various places all over the Bay Area, and I ask them if they don't have the date in front of them when they think it was taken, invariably they guess anywhere from the 1930s to the early 60s, usually 40s or 50s. That's part of what makes it so remarkable. This was taken in 1864 and is obviously, therefore, extremely naturalistic and realistic and evocative of the subject, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. The inner personality and state of mind of the subject by one of the first famous photographers, maybe one of the most famous ever in the 19th century, Julia Margaret Cameron, Cameron. The title of this is Portrait of Ellen Terry, Ellen, and then Terry, 1864. There's a lot to say about Margaret Cameron, so we'll just make the main points here. First of all, she is probably the first famous woman photographer, which brings up a fact about photography that makes it different than almost all the other visual arts at that time. Women were not allowed, or just not given much of an opportunity to participate in most of the other visual arts, of course, sculpture and painting a little, and not in architecture until, we'll talk about this in a future lecture, Julia Morgan and people of her generation in the 1890s, finally women of her generation. But that's way, way later than, of course, the other visual arts. But photography is different. Photography is more egalitarian, if you want to use that phrase, because it was accessible to people, middle-class people, whatever their social, economic, or I should say their, ethnic and or gender, background was. Women could participate, in other words, as readily and prove their, skill, their talent, their creativity. Much more readily and have their work appreciated by the public and therefore, make them successful much more easily than in painting, which of course was much more male dominated, and sculpture, let alone architecture. Okay, so Julia Margaret Cameron didn't start taking photos till she was 46 when one of her daughters, an adult daughter of hers, gave her a camera, I believe as a birthday present. And she began observing people in ways no one other early amateur photographers had never done, and their moods, their states of mind, their inner thoughts and feelings, and she was brilliant at capturing them. For instance, this young woman here, Mellon Terry, was about to go on the London stage for the first time in at least a significant, if not starring role. That's a major accomplishment for any actor, but especially at 18. And here she is. My father did some acting in a couple of movies, Hollywood movies actually, believe it or not. And so I used to go with him to auditions in L.A. And he and his fellow, aspiring actors call this centering. She's centering herself. She's thinking about what she has to do to perform well that night and to go on the stage and be successful. Of course, the anxiety, pressure, tension would have to be quite high in anyone, but especially someone only 18. And so she's leaning against the wall of probably a kid, looks like kitchen wallpaper from the 50s at my grandmother's house. But in any case, very modern looking wallpaper for that era. This is mid-Victorian times, remember. And she's dressed in what looks like a 1960s peasant blouse from the hippie era that I remember seeing all over California at that time. But obviously it's perhaps related to the role she's about to play. But it's a combination of the pose, which may or may not have been suggested by the photographer, but either way it captures the inner, state of mind of someone about to make a major step forward in their chosen career, and the intense introspection that might lead to just before she was about to do that. It was taken at a friend's house. She was the daughter of a good friend of Julia Margaret Cameron. That was a favorite approach of Margaret Cameron, is to photograph people she knew, as well as, she did both, famous figures in science, literature, and politics, leading figures. Most of whom were, of course, men in British society at that time. She did both. We'll see one of those second type of photos of hers or portraits in the next slide. But it's the lighting is the other part of this that makes it or marks it as remarkably ahead of its time. The natural look, it's only slightly soft, but she would have had to be very, very skilled, and by this time she had been taking portraits for many years, at figuring out, the positioning or placing of the subject of this young woman, and where the light was coming from, and how long an exposure. It's masterful. I think that's the right word for it. So that's why this image is still to this day surprises people when they see it as to how early it is and how naturalistic it is. Okay, so formal analysis. Really carefully balanced. She's right in the middle of a circular image, and with the shoulders off to the right and her head tilted toward the left. Clearly it's balanced left to right. You could say weighted toward the bottom because her head obviously is much narrower than her torso. There's the rhythm of her hair, her face, the blouse, her fingers, the wallpaper. It is dynamic and stable. She's standing upright and therefore is mostly stable. And the wall behind her obviously is, but there's a lot of diagonal to her head, her neck, and her raised arm, and the top of her blouse. The simulated texture is is realistic, I meant to say, and I would say mostly sharp, at least on her head, certainly. Maybe a little less so on her hand and the blouse. But the modeling is soft yet realistic or strong, and that's an important balance achieved, because many early photos were either super sharp but stilted, where the person stood or sat still for 30 seconds because of the long exposures that they had to have with those cameras and the lenses they had back then. So this seems much more lifelike and naturalistic and spontaneous. Like she just walked over the wall and paused to gather her strength, her courage, and think about where she was going, and her friend Margaret just decided to take her portrait at that moment. It probably is, of course, somewhat staged, but nonetheless it has a naturalistic appearance, of course. Obviously neutral. There's no warm or cool colors. There's no carved or drawn line. It's only visual lines around the outer edges of her figure and her clothing. It has one large mass. Obviously she is the largest mass, and then there's only the other is the wall behind her, and you can't see all of it, so I would say that makes her the largest mass. And for space, you have, in this case, just overlapping foreshortening. I don't think there's enough space here to see any kind of effect of a visual approximation of scientific perspective. It's not relevant here, and of course there's no atmospheric perspective. That's it. Let's now take a look at another Julia Margaret Cameron portrait, a very different one. This slide is another photo by Julia Cameron, Portrait of Thomas Carlyle, and that's Carlyle, 1867. I've already discussed who she was, although I did make one minor error in the age she was when she got her first camera. She was 49, which actually was as long as many people lived at that time. She was from an upper middle class family, and that gave her more access to some of the subjects that we've mentioned on the last slide, and now here's an example of that, of famous leaders in the fields of science and literature and politics in British society. Thomas Carlyle was a very famous and highly respected British historian. He'd already had, I'm sure, more than a dozen books on history, European mostly, and British history, published by this time. And so the public knew who he was, or the educated public would have known right away who he was. But she did something totally different here than any other portrait I've seen. I've seen other portraits of him and other portraits, of course, at that time in England of famous people. She deliberately made it out of focus, more so than the portrait of Mellon Terry even, because she's trying not, and this is her philosophy of photography that makes her so distinctive and ahead of her time. One of the things that makes her ahead of her time, which is, that you can just take a super sharp photo and have someone hold still, as I was mentioning with the last slide, for X seconds and not breathe, and you get this stilted effect. At least that's how many people see it. Not necessarily lifeless, but a really stiff, formal appearance. And that focuses entirely, or almost entirely, on the physical attributes or appearance of the person, the surface appearance. She wanted to go beyond that. So with her various use of lighting and naturalistic poses and soft, anywhere from slightly soft like that last portrait of Mellon Terry to really almost deliberately out of focus on this one, of softer focus than most portrait photographers, she was attempting to capture the inner thoughts and feelings of her subjects. And I think everyone today would agree she brilliantly succeeded at doing that. Of course, he was, obviously someone with great deep thoughts, to use the line from the old Saturday Night Live routine. who would have been interviewed a lot both in person at lectures. He gave lectures all over England. He had a large following. And in the print media, the newspapers and magazines of that time. And so his intellectual capacities were well known. But I think she captures those brilliantly here. And she also doesn't focus on the fact that he was, quite old at this point and had been in the public eye for decades. Because if it's super sharp, you would notice more of the imperfections, quote-unquote, wrinkles and lines in his face than you do here. Here you notice more, I think, his inner persona, which was her whole purpose. And again, she was ahead of her time in that regard. Okay, this is clearly balanced. He's right in the middle, left to right. You could say, because you can't even see that much of his shoulders, but if you count that area as wider, then you could say it's unbalanced toward the bottom. Once again, it's black and white, so it's all neutral, no warm or cool colors. It's really only one mass. You can't break it down. And for this, if there's any overlapping, it's of his hair and beard over his face, and I guess his jacket or coat is really probably a coat over and collar over his shoulders. So no other techniques for space are visible. It's mostly stable, but it has dynamic qualities because of the lines of his bangs or hair over his forehead and his beard. Obviously, human faces are both stable and dynamic when they're looking straight at us. His head is upright and very much in a stable position, but the details of the face are dynamic, so it's both. There's just soft visual line here, and then again, a soft but realistic modeling, deliberately so, much softer even than the last one we saw, but realistic cement textures on the hair and the skin, and less so on the clothing. And line here is just visual line, obviously. And there would not have been really any other way to capture the quality of his personality and his intellect and his reputation, really. She was deferring to him as a person she had greatly admired and respected and knew before she decided to ask if she could take his portrait. And this image of him was used, I believe, in some of the books he later had published or later editions of his earlier books, or it certainly was known. It was seen in some places in British society. It was reproduced. People might have had copies of it on their wall if they were fellow academicians or historians or teachers who admired his works. Okay. This photo is one of my favorites in the history of photography or photojournalism. It's one of the first examples of photojournalism, at least in the United States, and therefore very much of a seminal work of art. Remember, we've used that word before with painting and other types of visual arts. A work of art that breaks new ground, whatever medium it's in, can be called a seminal work of art. This clearly is that. The artist's name, photographer, obviously at this point he was way ahead of his time. I'll explain why. And therefore truly an artist. Rees, R-I-I-S, his last name. Jacob was his first name. Rees, Bandit's Roost. And that's, of course, B-A-N-D-I-T apostrophe S. Roost, of course, is R-O-O-S-T. 1888. Jacob Riis was I believe he was Norwegian immigrant to the United States. But his adult life, early on in his adult life, he became a photographer, and he also was a writer, and then he was able to combine those two skills into what you see here as an example, a very early example of photojournalism, which now is a common field in the media, print media, and electronic media. So what's going on here? Well, you might be able to guess that this is a slimy, very depressed economically alleyway, and it's in New York. I believe it's in the area at that time they called Hell's Kitchen, another phrase for that area, or an area nearby. These are neighborhoods, very poor, overcrowded, crime-ridden neighborhoods with almost entirely immigrant populations in Manhattan that mushroomed into tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people living in these kinds of areas. Different ethnic groups usually congregated in different parts of New York, as often was the case with other big cities all over the world, but especially the United States. As we discussed, America absorbed 100 million immigrants between 1820 and 1920, and only a few, 10% or so, went back to their own countries, according to most records or demographic research. It's a huge number, and so on average, about 1 million a year. Obviously, that would have slowed way down during the Civil War and World War I, but except for those kinds of slower years, there was up to or even over 1 million people a year coming into the U.S., and most of them entered through New York. So what we have here are a couple of thugs. It should be obvious. The two guys in the hats staring at us, one of whom has a club out. The other one almost certainly has a gun of some kind, perhaps a zip gun, they called them. As some of you know what those are, handmade weapons. They were almost certainly thugs who would rob you as soon as look at you and beat you to death, or kill you and leave you for dead or try rob you and then leave you for dead if you try to resist. There was a growing call in New York at the time for something to be done about the high crime rate in certain neighborhoods. Jacob Riis was one of those who looked beyond the obvious surface issue and just the numbers of crimes committed or victims of crimes in different parts of New York, especially in these poorer neighborhoods, to the root causes. And he would have accompanied, this is part of a series of photos he did on poverty, disease, overcrowding, unemployment, and of course discrimination, which there was against, starting with the Irish, large numbers of immigrants from Europe first, and then of course from Asia, and eventually Southern blacks coming to the north during World War I. But this is a period when it was really the common thing to just assume that these people were persona non gratis. They were allowed to come in because at that time we didn't have limitations on immigration yet. Those soon followed, but at least from Europe, certainly not yet. And so these particular poor neighborhoods were looked down on by people as just hotbeds of crime without any consideration by most people, at least in the middle and upper classes, as to what caused or led to those crimes. And he wanted people to be aware of those living conditions that they were forced into, these immigrant families. Sometimes 15 to a room, multiple generations living under the same roof, or several families occupying a single bedroom apartment or something like that, as is the case here. You can see by the people leaning out their windows how crowded this area is, the ones lining the street on both sides, or the alley, I should say. So he wrote articles accompanying his photographs, which were published in, I forget which one, but one of the bigger New York papers, and they did bring attention to the issues of discrimination and crowding and housing issues, as well as poverty and disease and lack of educational opportunities. So at least some people began in New York, middle class and upper class people in positions of influence, to try and address those issues. They called them slum reform or slum clearance, even sometimes measures. And that wasn't always the best solution, to just knock down some of these neighborhoods and then build housing that some of the people there couldn't afford. But there were some improvements, at least, in terms of services that weren't even thought of being provided before this, through most of the 1800s, by city governments or state governments. So he did his best as a reformer. He was an early reformer by using images like this. Now, he, unlike most photographers, he's someone who was willing to take risks in what he did. He could easily have been robbed, taken his photo, or even possibly killed by certainly the two men to the far, standing and staring at us to the far right. He did say, by covering somewhat, not covering, but I meant obscuring, I should say, obscuring their faces in shadow. And when they were reproduced in the earliest forms of photographs at the time in magazines or books, they weren't yet photos in newspapers, not this far back. Soon there would be, within the next decade. But made sure that they knew he wasn't going to give away facts about who they were, their identity, so they could be arrested by the police. And so they let him take this photo, obviously. That took some courage for him to arrange that. So it's an amazing image. Okay, now, it's balanced left to right because of the buildings in the alley down the middle. If you count the slick, slimy paving stones as mass, which they are, and the hanging laundry up above, it's balanced top to bottom as well. Of course, it's both stable and dynamic, but really mostly stable if you look carefully. The dynamic features are mostly the women and or perhaps it looks like one or two children leaning out of windows on the right side. But the buildings and, of course, the men certainly standing, and even the man sitting on the stoop, are all pretty stable. It's obviously neutral, no warm or cool colors. Super realistic Lumiere texture. It would have been hard to get this image like this with this much sharpness and clarity with the early cameras, but at this point, from what I would gather based on just the history of technology, he probably used a Brownie, that kind of camera I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, which was handheld, lighter weight, more affordable, and could take pictures a little more quickly. The lens was a little bit faster than some of the lenses of earlier cameras. But he still had to wait a while to get the right lighting and images. And of course the simulated textures are sharp and realistic on the slimy, slick stones at the bottom of the alley and on the wood and brick walls of the two slum tenement apartment buildings, and on the clothing and of course hair and faces of the figures, except the two guys whose hats shade their faces that are closest to us. So it's all got realistic cement texture, fairly sharp for this period in time. He's not deliberately trying to take an out-of-focus photo. There's a little of that aspect to the softness of the modeling further back you go. But that's just a result of the technology limitations of cameras at that time. Of course, it's got the, we already mentioned rhythm, I believe, right? The repeated shapes of the standing and seated people, and of course the hats on most of the men, and the stones in the alleyway, and the wood siding there that's called clapboarding on the wooden tenement to the left of the picture. The largest mass, that's hard to say. It could be the alley itself, or it could be the brick building because you see a little more of it than the wooden one. So if you look at it that way, you could say the alley, then the building on the right, then the building on the left, and then the man standing closest to us. And of course the modeling, as I was saying about the texture, is sharp and realistic on the figures in the foreground, a little less so as it goes further back. And of course this, again, no techniques for space here, it's all real space captured in an image, so it has the appearance of scientific perspective, and this one would have atmospheric perspective further back almost, although it's a black and white print. There seems to be some aspect of that in the distance there, the farthest end of the alley where the laundry is still visible, but it's more out of focus than the rest of it. And then of course it's got overlapping foreshortening and diminishing size. And the lines here are all visual. There are no carved or painted lines. Okay. This next slide is by a woman, an American woman, named Casimir. I believe her first name was Gertrude. K-A-S-E-B-I-E-R. Blessed art thou among women. I think those words are all pretty obvious, so I won't spell them. Blessed art thou among women, 1900. Gertrude Casimir was one of the first famous American women photographers, and as I said earlier about the egalitarian nature of photography as an art form, it was easier for her to be a success and become well known and have her pictures in the public's eye as a woman than it would have been if she tried to do that in painting or sculpture, for reasons I've already mentioned about the affordability and accessibility of cameras. By this time, certainly, well after Kodak had invented the Brownie. So here we have an image that fools a lot of people. Many of them assume that this is a little girl probably with her mother about in the morning, perhaps to send her off to school. Well, that's partly correct, but it's not a little girl. It's a boy. This would be probably this woman's son. Boys were dressed that way in middle or mid-middle and upper middle class families, and even some upper class families. Not in the working class poor neighborhoods or lower middle class families. It was just a tradition to dress them almost exactly like girls, with long hair and, yes, even dresses, until they were like 6, 7, 8, 9, even 10 sometimes. That was a late Victorian and early Edwardian, so we're talking about, turn of the century tradition among upper middle class and upper class families. Many of them did that. So this is a mother talking to her son, and it's a line from I believe it's the Lord's Prayer, anyway, famous Catholic, of course, prayer that implies something more religious than this image is probably meant to evoke. However, there appears to be some kind of perhaps a religious print on the wall behind the mother's head that may be an angel or a saint or somebody from a figure from the Bible. It's hard to tell. But anyway, since that is a line from the Bible, it is assumed again by many people when they first see this photo or read the title that it must be some kind of a religious invocation. But there's another interpretation, the one that I think makes the most sense. He's probably about to go to school with girls for the first time in his life. He's perhaps the age of 6 or 7, and compulsory education wasn't yet universal. But if it was done where she lived, I believe in New York City, it would have been by that time, by 1900. And so perhaps he'd been homeschooled, or he'd gone to a private school or a boys' school before this, and this is the interpretation that I think makes the most sense, and many other historians do. The mother's telling him, look, I know you don't have much experience, maybe he had no sisters, or he's an only child, with girls, those strange creatures, that you haven't had much chance to interact with, but you'll be fine. Just treat them appropriately, or as, the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and you'll be fine. So there is somewhat of a religious component in that interpretation, but it's more socializing and a cultural context that is probably what would be the reason for her saying that to her son. You'll be blessed among women if you treat them fairly, and they'll respond. And so perhaps helping ease his anxiety about going to school. If you look closely at his face, he does look like he has a slight bit of tenseness or anxiety about this experience. Perhaps, if it is that, of a first day at a public school with those strange creatures called girls his age. Okay, so that's one of the interpretations and one of the main ones for this. In any case, she is really one of the first women to have her images mass-produced in books and magazines. And by this time, there were newspaper photos, so I believe some of her photos were in newspapers as well. She was quite successful. Okay, formal analysis, it's almost entirely stable. There's a slight dynamic quality to their two heads, but otherwise everything is upright, fairly straight. And of course, it's soft, again, diffused modeling on the mother even more than the little boy. We'll say it's almost certainly a boy. What it is, actually. And then the faces. His face is a little more in focus because she's apparently in motion, about to kiss him, goodbye for the morning as he heads off to school, perhaps. And so there's a little bit of difference in the degree of sharpness of the modeling. And the same is for the simulated texture between the mother and the boy. It's a little sharper on him than on her, both those things. Obviously, once again, black and white, so it's neutral, no warm or cool colors. She's the largest mass, then him, and then I guess you could say the print behind them, or the floorboards, perhaps, if you count them as a single mass. For here we do have scientific perspective. There would be a vanishing point, overlapping and foreshortening. I would say there isn't much diminishing size, not that I can see here. And the lines are visual around the outer edges of the figures and on the floorboards and the framing of the door. Then, let's see, balance? Yeah, it's roughly balanced left to right. I mean, she's taller than him and obviously larger. but I think when you draw a line down the middle, her head's leaning over slightly into the left side of the photo. And when you add the door frames, I think it's roughly balanced left to right, and because of the floorboards and the print behind them on the back wall, I would say roughly balanced top to bottom as well. Okay. Okay, this is another seminal work of art, absolutely groundbreaking. And it's Lumiere, Lumiere, Girl with an Umbrella. Some books have it as Girl with a Red Umbrella, but we'll go with Stockstead, the textbook's title. Girl with an Umbrella, of course that's Umbrella. 1906. This is the first mass-produced color photograph that could be, seen by people in thousands, I would assume, or at least hundreds, if not thousands, of copies in books and magazines. Not at that point in newspapers. It probably wasn't used for newspaper or illustration of any kind. It's an experiment. It's seminal because the Lumiere Brothers, by the way, they were world famous by this time already, and their name is still famous throughout Europe, at least. Not just France, they were French, if that's not obvious from the spelling of their name. They were the founders of the movie theater concept, or you can't say industry per se, but you almost could, or business, if you want to say movie theater business, or concept of chains of theaters. There are Lumiere theaters all over Europe, especially in big cities in France, like Paris. To this day, still named after them. One of the two brothers, I think it was Charles, but in any case, you just need to know his last name for this purpose of this lecture, was experimenting as well. By the way, the theaters, I should mention this, they started in 1894 in Paris, before there were any movie theaters in the U.S., because Edison, though he had invented in 1893, we covered this at the start of the lecture, the first motion picture camera, he hadn't yet succeeded in getting more than a small venue here and there where he could show his short moving pictures. And I don't think he had a way of making money from them. And there was no Hollywood, not that far back, nothing close to it. In fact, Hollywood, the first movies in Hollywood weren't filmed until after 1910, more like 1914 or so, in the early 1910s. So 20 years before that, the French were already making the Lumiere Brothers, making movies and showing them in their own theaters and charging admission and making a profit. So one of the two brothers came up with this process after much experimentation of multiple filters of the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, I believe that's what they were, over the camera lenses that he used to take photos like this one, which then, when the prints were made from them, the colors, the different aspects of the colors that came onto the negative would overlap, and the final version would produce a rough approximation of real colors. You notice it's a little bit on the pastelish, or washed out, some would even say, side of the scale for the colors, especially on some of the plants around the road here. This is a rural scene in probably southern France, where the hills are like that, and you see, if you look carefully, vineyards and red clay tile houses, which almost certainly were stone-walled homes from hundreds of years earlier. And then a probably fairly old tree trunk leaning into the upper right side of the picture, and then the woman with her flowered hat and red umbrella sitting on a rock or a stone of some kind. So it's meant to show off the variety of colors, probably springtime, looking at the vegetation, the way it appears, and of course all the flowers in bloom. It would have been was a very popular image. It was reproduced many times after this, because it was such a unique and startling almost achievement to be able to finally get color photos out of negatives and not have to hand tint a black and white photo to make it look like it was colored, is how they were done before this. Okay, so formal analysis, it's roughly balanced, left to right, certainly with a road down the middle. You might think that the tree trunk leaning off on the right side and the woman visually weighted more towards the right, but with the number of trees and the hills in the background, it's roughly balanced. And of course it's full of rhythm. Excuse me, the rhythm of the bushes, the trees, the stones, and even the gravel in the country road, and the houses on the distant hillside. It's both stable and dynamic. It's dynamic on the leaning tree trunk, but stable on the woman, dynamic on her umbrella, stable on the road mostly, and the bushes, well, they're round, but they're fairly straight, upright, and the trees on that side of the road. So it's a mixture of both stable and dynamic. Here we have definitely the visual effect of overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size, scientific perspective, and atmospheric perspective on the hillside to some degree, or even on the trees at the end of the road, or the bend in the road we can see at the distance furthest away from the camera here. So it has all those major techniques, visual effect of them, for realistic depictions of space. The largest mass, well, that's hard to say. You could say it's the hill where the tree is leaning out of it on the right, perhaps, or the hill in the background, because if you could see all of it, it would certainly be larger than any other section, or the road. I would leave that to you. And then after whichever those three objects you think is the largest mass, then it would probably be the leaning tree trunk, and then the girl, then her umbrella. Or perhaps the tree across the road from the leaning tree trunk, and then the woman. Here the lines, sharp outlines are visual, at least on the objects closest to us. They become softer and more diffused, as does the modeling, of course, on the plants and the hill and the houses on the hill in the distance. It's fairly realistic and strong modeling and simulated textures on the foreground of the road, the rocks, the bushes closest to us, and of course the woman, her clothing, her hat, and her umbrella. And here we have warm colors on the yellow leaves of some of the trees and flowers on the hillside to the right, and on the flowers on the woman's hat and her umbrella. Her dress has a pinkish cast, but I think that's a reflected light from the rocks. It looks like a white dress and a white hat. That would be cool. And of course the road is mostly dirt colored, which is warm, but obviously the stones in the road are white or off-white and therefore cool. And the green terrain around them, mostly of the plants, bushes, and trees, of course, are cool. This slide is not one from the syllabus, though I have had it on my syllabus in the past, so it's a substitute for what would have been the last slide, Steiglitz, the Flatiron Building. The image that I had of that is not very sharp and clear. This certainly is. This is the Grand Court, or Court of Honor, is how it was often called, at the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. I actually wrote a couple of articles about this World's Fair when I was writing articles for magazines and newspapers before I started teaching. My great aunt was married at this World's Fair on my mother's side. She got married on the first Ferris wheel, which is invisible in this picture. It would have been behind the photographer. This event cannot be compared to any event ever since. It had the largest attendance proportionately to our population of any event in the entire history of the United States. 28 million people attended this fair in the 1 year. It wasn't even a year, it was 8 months that it was open in 1893. It was a year late in celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage to the New World, because they got a late start, Chicago did. They got the commission to design and build this World's Fair. So they created a kind of a world within a world, a self-contained city. It was called the White City. That was the nickname. All the buildings had white paint on the exterior of plaster over wood framing. Only a couple of them had permanent, materials like metal framing. But all the buildings were either torn down or burned. Some of them burned down in an accidental fire within a year or two after the fair closed. So it was just a brief, ephemeral moment in the history of the United States as we were emerging as a world power for the first time and trying to show off that influence and importance and power to the world. For instance, the Statue of Liberty here from the back has an American, well, not say American, but an eagle, which is one of our symbols, of course, of the American nation state, if you will, landing or with its wings spread out over a globe. That would have been gilded. The statue would have been almost certainly plaster for this fair. A model of it was recreated in metal and also spray painted, I believe, today, or covered anyway in gold paint, not probably spray painted. And that's actually sitting in a park in Chicago near where the fair happened, but it's only a third this size. It was an immense statue. The statue was about 100 feet tall. The building at the far end of this, it's a canal. Actually, the city was crisscrossed, or this fairgrounds called the White City was crisscrossed with these man-made, or recently created canals. And all of the landscaping, by the way, was done by Frederick Law Olmsted, who did the landscaping for Central Park. The architects here included Louis Sullivan, one of the first skyscraper architects. We'll talk about him in another lecture on early modern architecture. And he was the man who trained Frank Lloyd Wright, so Wright was involved in some of the planning, as was Julia Morgan, the first woman architect in American history to have her own practice when she went to observe. She didn't design any of the buildings, but she went to observe them as a student of architecture when Bernard Maybeck, who we'll talk about him too, the first great green architect in American history, was working in the 1890s in California, and she was a student of his. So he influenced her to consider observing this incredible event. When I said 28 million people, I actually didn't close that thought, or complete, that thought, which is, that doesn't sound to some people like a lot today. Well, it's still a big number. But keep in mind, the entire United States population at that time was only 60 million. That means nearly half of the entire population of our country went to this one event. That has never happened before since in the history of the United States. It also was a showcase for technology. For instance, the first electric launches were here, the first escalators, they call it moving sidewalks, the first searchlights, the first elevated trains, the first gasoline-powered automobiles in the U.S. were displayed, and a young man named Henry Ford, was inspired by what he saw there in the transportation building, they called it, from inventors that were mostly from Europe at that time, to create a certain car called the Ford, which of course became the most successful automobile in the world within a few years. The architecture, as you can see from this, is all neoclassic, actually almost Renaissance revival, excuse me, and therefore evocative of European traditions. And that's what some critics, even back then and certainly afterwards, criticized this design for this fair, this entire fairgrounds, because of that. They said it was too backward looking and too much of a spin-off of European, or copy of European prototypes from the late Renaissance, and then revived again in Europe in places like Paris with the Paris Opera House. That's called Beaux-Arts. And we'll talk about that style of architecture when we do the architecture lecture. And so, yes, this was Beaux-Arts, meaning Renaissance revival, but in America with metal or wood framing, mass-produced. These buildings were all built within less than a year. It was a remarkable achievement. One of them, the largest one, you can see it just to the left there. It's called the the right, where the flags were flying and the arched entryway. That was the largest building in the world up to that time. It could hold 300,000 people inside one building at one time. And then we also have the fact that the midway where the Ferris wheel was the first midway ever. It was the granddaddy of all midways, where, of course, all of the food and entertainment venues were, and exhibits from all over the world. Little Egypt supposedly did her first, she did for sure do her first belly dancing there. And there are, last but not least, some historians believe there's evidence that Edison had at least a couple of he had machines you could called kinetoscopes that you could look into, a little viewer, and see some of his early films. We know he had them up and running by 1894. Some people think the last month of this fair, he might have gotten one or two of them into one of the exhibit halls, and people would have paid, of course, to get in line to look at those images of 1 or 2 minute moving pictures. There's no certainty on that. It's still debated. But certainly there were a lot of other inventions here, and Edison had his electric light shows, as you know, inventor as he was of the light bulb, that made people ooh and all. The first colored electric light show ever shown to the public was also done in the electrical hall at this fair. A remarkable achievement. Now, this is not a work of art, so I'm not going to analyze it formally. It was a photograph taken by an unnamed photographer who was probably hired as an official photographer for the guidebook that this would have appeared in. And then, after the fair, as a souvenir, people would often buy those books at the fair or even afterwards if they went to this fair. They were one of the nearly half of the population of this country, including my great aunt, who actually went to the fair. And yes, people got married on the Ferris wheel. It was 265 feet tall, the first Ferris wheel, and each of the cars was a railroad-sized car that could hold 60 people, so it could hold 2,000 people at one time. So if you had a wedding party with up to 60 people, you could have the wedding inside one of those cars, which is what my great aunt did. Okay, so that's it for this